Hi, everybody. You're listening to Comics and History, episode number 103, part 3, Spotlight on Green Lantern Alan Scott in the Copper Age concluded. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session as we will definitely conclude our look at Earth's first Green Lantern, Alan Scott, during the Copper Age. Holy goodness. This episode is approaching the length of episode 100, and that's amazing given the fact that we're looking at a period in Alan Scott's history in which he was absent for half of the age. I mean, the Copper Age is one of the most important periods in DC history. Alan was absent for almost half of it, and yet what happened to him during this time was still so significant that it really has warranted the amount of time which I'm dedicating to this particular recording, but I am going to wrap things up here. I first need to backtrack because I've been referring to Alan Scott as Earth's first Green Lantern, and to a degree that was still true during the Copper Age, although certain stories within Green Lantern Corps Quarterly would suggest that Alan technically wasn't the first human to take the name of Green Lantern. And what I mean by that is there was one issue of Green Lantern Corps Quarterly in which readers were introduced to a man named Waverly Sawyer. And I want to say that Sawyer lived during the expansion of the American West. And so even though he did not have a ring and lantern for very long, because he lived during the 19th century. Technically, Waverly Sawyer was the first human to wear a Green Lantern ring. But really, in terms of a person who was the first to wear a Green Lantern ring with any real consistency, longevity, it was certainly Alan Scott. But sadly, as the Copper Age was coming to an end with the publication of Zero Hour, Alan Scott would find that his time as a Green Lantern was also coming to an end. I'm very fond of Zero Hour. For those of you who have been listening to this show for some time, you may very well remember that my very first episodes of Comics in History were all about Zero Hour. This was the event which got me interested in reading comics on a regular basis. Not just here and there, waiting for relatives to pick up a couple of comics for me from the convenience store, from the flea market. Zero Hour really got me invested in the idea of following a company's continuity on a month-to-month basis. And there are a lot of people who laugh at Zero Hour now and say, oh, it looks so 90s. Look at the fashions. Look at the costumes. Look at some of the names. But I think if you put that mindset aside, it's still a very enjoyable read. And it's a quick read, too. It came out in 5 consecutive weeks. The tie-ins were great, and what came after, Zero Month, was very important because it helped provide a revised history for the DC universe, as well as revised histories for some of its key characters. Now, there are also a lot of fans who are very angry with Zero Hour because it was the series that marked the end of the Justice Society of America. And a lot of people put the blame squarely on the shoulders of Dan Jurgens, who was the writer and the penciler of Zero Hour. And I need to come to the defense of Mr. Jurgens and say that it was not his intention to kill off the Justice Society of America. If you listen to episode number 200 of the From Crisis to Crisis podcast hosted by Michael Bailey and Jeffrey Taylor, you'll hear an interview with Dan Jurgens in which he states that he actually advocated for the JSA. He actually went to editorial and said, okay, look, I know there's only one single universe. I get that. But can't we make an exception for the JSA? They are the company's first heroes. They should really have their own Earth. We can put them on a new Earth too. We can make it a period piece so they can all be young again. Wouldn't fans really like seeing a book like that? And editorial's answer was no. No parallel Earths, no parallel dimensions, no period pieces. This is our chance to put the JSA to bed once and for all. Their time has come. We're moving forward with the current crop of heroes, as well as a whole set of new heroes that were coming to the fore. Heroes who have been created by the Death and Return of Superman and Nightfall storylines. So it fell to Dan Jurgens to write a story in which the JSA had one final stand before they would be put to bed, seemingly for good. And before the main story even started in issue 4 of Zero Hour, Alan Scott would make a very important appearance in the 0 Hour tie-in issue of Green Lantern. This was Green Lantern Volume 3, issue 55. And the cover's really interesting because it makes it look like Alan in his new costume is about to go toe-to-toe with a very angry Kyle Rayner. In the story, we see a very young, very inexperienced Kyle Rayner taking on Major Force. Force had just murdered Kyle's girlfriend, Alex, and shoved her remains in Kyle's refrigerator. So Kyle lays a massive beatdown on Major Force. He also manifests his Green Lantern power battery. And he's just so angry that when the authorities come for Major Force, Kyle brushes them off and races back to his apartment. And at this point, Kyle is racked with guilt. He's feeling that it's all his fault that his girlfriend died. If only he hadn't gone through with his idea of becoming a superhero and a media darling, his girlfriend would still be alive. And what do you know? He enters his darkened apartment, and there's this young blonde-haired man wearing this red and green costume and brandishing a glowing green ring. And the young man explains to Kyle that his name is Alan Scott, and he is here to tell Kyle that he is needed. And so in this issue, Alan gives Kyle, as well as new readers, a primer on Hal Jordan, his background as the greatest of all of the Green Lanterns. We see his descent into madness and his transformation into a villainous character who would later come to be known as Parallax. Alan also explains that he was part of a strike force that went into space to confront the now insane Hal Jordan and was quickly struck down. And so Alan finishes by telling Kyle that, yeah, it seems like Kyle's going through a rough patch, but he's basically got to suck it up. He's got to go back out there, and he's got to be part of the hero community that is working to stop this coming crisis in time. And Alan flies off. And this is what leads to Kyle leaving his apartment, questioning what to do. And in Zero Hour issue number 4, we see that Kyle meets Superman and Metron and agrees to help Superman broadcast a message to the entire hero community to come together in Metropolis to deal with the impending 0 hour. This issue 55, will certainly seem quite jarring to readers today, especially readers who came on board with Kyle's run of Green Lantern comics following 0 hour, because in the second half of the 90s, Alan Scott and Kyle Rayner developed this really nice bond. I wouldn't call it a father-son bond, but certainly Alan became something of a mentor to Kyle. Well, he very nearly became Kyle's father-in-law, as Kyle and Jade nearly got married. And what I really liked about the Alan-Kyle relationship is that while Alan was there to act as a mentor, he was also very respectful of the fact that Kyle's ring operated completely differently than his. And I'm going to have more fun expanding on that when I talk about Alan Scott in my spotlight on Alan during the second half of the 90s recording. But here it seemed very odd in that Alan came across as very cold, very blunt. And this actually set an important precedent for future stories, such as the 52 weekly series in the 2000s, where we would see that in a moment of crisis, Alan could become very direct and to the point. He'd become like this very steel-willed general, if you will. And he was able to put any emotions that he was feeling to the side. And he expected the same of others. I'm thinking of a Justice JSA issue where a depowered Jesse Chambers would come to work at the JSA Brownstone, and Alan gave her a major lecture in which he questioned her ethic and he questioned why she was there. And it wasn't Alan being a jerk to her. It was just Alan being very direct and saying things that Jessie needed to hear in order to motivate her to go back out there and build herself back up after making a terrible mistake. So stories like those with Alan as a steel-willed general really start with issue number 55 of the third volume of Green Lantern. Now, as for Alan's contribution within the 0 hour 5-parter itself, Alan would join the majority of his JSA cohorts, with the exception of Hawkman and Hawkgirl, who went on a separate mission of their own to face a villainous Extant. And for those of you who don't know or don't remember, in a 2-part story in Showcase leading into 0 hour, Hank Hall, aka Monarch, did the whole Pokemon thing and evolved into Extant, being of tremendous power, somebody who was capable of traveling throughout time. And when the JSA confronted Extant, he took them down rather quickly. He used his powers to age all of the JSAers back to their true chronological ages. And for certain JSAers, this was fatal. Dr. Midnight, Hourman, Adam, they all died of massive heart attacks within seconds. Wildcat, as well as the Sandman, they would suffer heart attacks too, but they got medical attention in time and they were stabilized. Jay Garrick was transformed into an elderly man, although his endurance still seemed to be better than the rest. ostensibly because of his connection to the Speed Force, but his career was done